The envelope arrived on a Thursday, cream-colored, heavy, expensive, the kind of envelope that whispers wealth before it even opens its mouth. Ruth held it between her fingers like it might bite. Her name wasn't on it, not even a hint, just Mr. and Mrs. Green. That's when she knew her son's wedding was happening without her, not forgotten, just erased. She stood in her kitchen, staring at the gold-embossed card like it had slapped her. She had raised Matthew alone. 3 jobs, cold winters, burned fingers, broken dreams, and now she didn't even get a line on the invitation. But that was just the beginning, because the wedding, it was happening at her lakehouse. Her name wasn't on the card, but her land was on the map. And Ruth? She was done being silent. Let them decorate, let them toast. She had her own plans. The house was quiet in the kind of way that gets under your skin, too still, too measured, like it was holding its breath. Ruth Eleanor Bennett, 68, moved through the narrow hallway with a duster in one hand and a cup of cold tea in the other. She wore the same soft cardigan she'd worn every Tuesday for the past 3 years, the one with the threadbare sleeves and the faint scent of lavender she kept for herself. The photos on the mantel hadn't changed in a decade. Matthew at 4, holding a wooden sword made from leftover trim. Matthew at 9, face covered in freckles and chocolate cake. Matthew at 18, graduation cap askew, eyes full of somewhere else. That last one still hurt. She dusted his frame with care like she was brushing back a strand of hair from his real face. 10 years. That's how long it had been since he'd stepped foot in the house. Birthdays passed, holidays too. His voice came only in brief calls, timed like clockwork but drained of meaning. "I'm busy, Mom. We'll visit soon." But soon had become a word she stopped believing in. Ruth settled into her kitchen chair, the cushions sunken in just right, and stared out the window. The garden was overgrown. The fence was leaning. The bird bath had cracked in last winter's freeze. Still, she kept it all. Like Harold would have wanted. Harold, her husband, gone too soon. One afternoon, he went out for milk and never came back. Heart failure in the parking lot. She was 37. Matthew was 9. There had been no time for grief. Just bills, grocery lists, the silence of an empty bed, and a boy who needed everything. Ruth never remarried. She couldn't. She'd made a promise, whispered to Harold at the viewing, "I'll do both our jobs now." And she had. She took the early shift at the bakery, the late one at the diner. She sewed clothes, clipped coupons, walked miles when the car broke down. She missed PTA meetings, but never missed a parent-teacher conference. She skipped birthdays for extra shifts, but made sure the cake was on the table by dinner. Every small corner of her life bent toward Matthew. On his 12th birthday, after a homemade lasagna and 2 slices of boxed chocolate cake, Matthew had wrapped his skinny arms around her waist and looked up, eyes shining. "When I grow up, I'll take care of you, Mom. I'll get rich and you won't have to work anymore." She'd laughed, tousled his hair. "I don't need rich, baby. I just need you to remember me." "I promise," he'd said, solemn as a vow. "I'll never forget." But he had. After college, Matthew took a job in Chicago, then New York. Calls became shorter, less frequent. Visits dried up. Then came Vanessa, sharp, polished, capable. Ruth had only met her twice, once at a rushed brunch where Vanessa spent more time scrolling her phone than speaking. The second when they'd visited the lakehouse for a weekend. Ruth had cooked. Vanessa had ordered takeout behind her back. She took another sip of her cold tea. The lakehouse. That was the last place she'd seen Matthew in person. A faded cabin tucked beneath pine trees and fog. Harold had loved it, called it their forever place. It was the only thing Ruth refused to sell, even when money was tight. The deed still had both their names, hers and Harold's, in thick ink and permanent faith. She walked to the sideboard and pulled open the drawer. There it was, the folder marked Property Lake. Inside, the notarized deed, the water bills, the tax receipts, all in her name now, still hers. Her thumb ran along the edges of the folder. A small smile ghosted her face. She wasn't rich, but she had held on to something real. Then her eyes caught the envelope on the table again. Cream-colored, elegant. Ruth picked it up with 2 fingers like it might burn. "Mr. and Mrs. Green," it read. No return address. Inside, a wedding invitation. Not from Matthew, from Vanessa's parents. A celebration of their children. No mention of Ruth. No mother of the groom, not even and family. And yet, Ruth's lakehouse address printed in delicate serif font at the bottom. They hadn't invited her, but they'd taken her home. Ruth sat down, the folder in one hand, the invitation in the other. Her pulse was steady, but her chest felt hollow. Matthew had promised to take care of her. He'd promised never to forget. But maybe it wasn't forgetting. Maybe it was something worse. Maybe he remembered and chose silence anyway. She stared at the invitation again, angling it to catch the morning light. The gold embossing gleamed, flawless. Mr. and Mrs. Green cordially invite you. Ruth read the line over and over, as if repetition would somehow summon her name onto the page. Nothing. She opened the envelope again, inspecting it for any overlooked detail. Maybe her name was inside, tucked discreetly in a corner? A handwritten note? A scribbled Ruth, maybe? But no, it was all templated, curated, impersonal, a wedding planned by algorithms and Pinterest boards. Vanessa's parents were hosting it, her son's in-laws, people Ruth had never met. Strangers. Her hands began to tremble, not with rage, but with something quieter, colder, the kind of chill that came when you realized you were no longer seen as necessary, or even visible. She glanced at the bottom of the card again, the small print listing the venue, Cedar Hollow Lake Retreat. Her breath caught. That wasn't just any retreat. That was her lake house. The name had changed, clearly, rebranded for elegance, but the address hadn't. 42 Willow Bend Lane. She would know those numbers even in her sleep. She'd written them on every water bill for 30 years. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. A wave of disbelief washed over her, then was swept away by something much sharper, realization. They were holding the wedding at her home, her sanctuary, and they hadn't asked. No call, no courtesy, not even a polite formality. Ruth stood, the chair scraping loudly against the worn tile floor. She walked briskly to the filing cabinet, pulled out the property folder again, and flipped it open with purpose. There it was, the deed, clear as the sunrise. Owner, Ruth Eleanor Bennett, sole title holder. Harold's name had been removed a year after his death at the bank's insistence. She'd never remarried, never refinanced, no legal changes, no co-owners. They didn't have a right to use it, not without her. So why hadn't they asked? Because they didn't think they had to. Because she had never said no. Because Ruth, dependable Ruth, who never made a scene, who showed up with pies and thank you cards and silent grace, was just assumed to be amenable. She closed the folder slowly, pressed it flat beneath both palms, and leaned forward. The kitchen around her buzzed with quiet hums, refrigerator, old pipes, the whisper of wind through the eaves. But inside her, a different current surged, one that had been waiting for years, buried beneath every ignored phone call, every unopened birthday gift, every next time that never came. Matthew didn't forget her. He just stopped choosing her. And now, with Vanessa steering the ship, he'd gone fully adrift. They weren't just excluding her from the ceremony. They were rewriting the whole narrative. She wouldn't even exist in the photo album. Ruth sat back down, stared at the envelope again, and traced the name on the front. Mr. and Mrs. Green, Vanessa's parents, hosts, planners, patrons. Not a single mention of Matthew's side of the family. Not even a vague nod to the groom's mother. Just a clean omission. Ruth had been erased delicately, surgically. But the land? The land still remembered her. She remembered the summer Harold built the dock with his bare hands, cursing the planks that wouldn't sit right. She remembered Matthew's first swim, his arms flailing, Ruth running knee-deep in a skirt to catch him. The chipped coffee mug left on the porch railing, the wind chimes Harold hated but left up because she loved them. This house wasn't a venue, it was a monument, and if they thought they could throw satin over her memories and call it a wedding, they had underestimated her, badly. She pushed back from the table and moved through the house with new purpose. In the hall closet, she found the tote bag she used for important errands. Into it, she slipped the folder, the invitation, her reading glasses, and a pen. She paused at the doorway, then turned back and grabbed a framed photo of Harold. Just because. She didn't know what her next move would be, but she knew one thing for certain. This wedding wasn't happening on her land without her voice being heard. They had planned a ceremony, but Ruth? Ruth was planning a reckoning. The drive to the lake house was quiet, the kind of quiet that curled into your ears and asked questions you couldn't answer. Ruth kept both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead as tall pines lined the familiar road like stoic soldiers. It had been nearly a year since she'd last come this way. Back then, Matthew had said renovations were underway, something about the dock, the roof, a new paint job. Just fixing it up, Mom, nothing big. But she hadn't been invited back since. As the car rounded the final bend, the house came into view, and her heart sank. Gone was the pale blue siding Harold had chosen himself, the one he said reminded him of lake mornings. In its place stood a whitewashed facade, sleek and sterile. The shutters were jet black now, the porch redone with composite planks, modern, flawless, unrecognizable. She pulled into the gravel driveway, her tires crunching a sound that felt too loud for the moment. 3 cars were already there. Matthew's black SUV, Vanessa's sleek gray hybrid, and a rental she didn't recognize. Ruth turned off the engine but didn't move. Her hands remained on the wheel. This wasn't a homecoming, it was an inspection. The wind blew gently across the lake, carrying scents of pine and fresh varnish. It should have felt comforting. It didn't. She finally stepped out, the tote bag slung over her shoulder. The gravel shifted beneath her shoes as she made her way to the porch. The new door had a brushed steel handle and a digital keypad lock. Her own key wouldn't fit anymore. Of course it wouldn't. She knocked. The door opened a moment later, revealing Matthew in khakis and a button-up shirt rolled to his elbows. His hair was slightly tousled, and he looked like he hadn't slept. "Mom," he said, blinking. "Hello, Matthew," she replied calmly. "I thought I'd stop by. After all, my name's still on the deed." He flinched, just barely, but moved aside. "Come in." The moment her foot crossed the threshold, she felt the shift. The air was scented, vanilla and citrus, and the walls had been painted a cold shade of gray. The rug she'd bought in 1993 was gone. So was the old coat rack Harold built with his hands. She moved deeper into the living room, her eyes sweeping across the transformation. New furniture, minimalist decor. A stylish wooden beam had been added where Harold's antique clock used to hang. The kitchen had marble countertops now. The hanging mugs had vanished. No warmth, no history, just efficiency. She didn't speak, not yet. "Vanessa's in the backyard with the planner," Matthew offered, clearly scrambling to fill the silence. Ruth didn't respond. Instead, she walked slowly toward what used to be the dining room. The sideboard was gone. In its place, a curated wine rack and 2 modern bar stools. Then she noticed the corner. Once a small altar had stood there. A modest shrine to Harold, his photo, the folded flag from his military service, a candle, and the wedding band Ruth had removed only once, the day he died. All of it, gone. She turned sharply. "Where is the table?" Her voice was quiet but edged in steel. Matthew froze. "What?" "The altar. Where's your father's memorial?" He swallowed. "We moved some things around. Vanessa thought it might clash with the wedding photos." "What does that mean?" Before he could answer, a voice floated in from the hallway. "I'll get the proofs in a second," Vanessa was saying. "They're stunning. Wait until you see the lighting around the fireplace." She appeared in the doorway, wearing white flats and a silk blouse. She stopped cold at the sight of Ruth. "Oh," she said, "I didn't realize, Matthew, you didn't tell me your mother was coming." "She didn't need an invitation," Ruth said evenly, "not to my own house." Vanessa's mouth twitched into a practiced smile. "Of course not." Ruth didn't smile back. Instead, she moved past them both toward the hallway where old photo albums were once stacked in open shelves. They were gone too. In their place stood a slim console table covered in framed pictures. She stopped. There, centered among the photos, was a printed wedding portrait, an engagement photo, clearly, of Matthew and Vanessa. They stood hand in hand, smiling beneath the same exposed wooden beam she'd noticed earlier. But it wasn't just any beam. It was the exact spot where Harold's altar had stood. They'd taken the photo on top of it. She stepped closer, heart pounding in her ears. She could see it, the faint discoloration in the wood behind them. That had been Harold's corner, the sacred corner, and they'd used it as a backdrop. Ruth didn't say a word. She turned to Matthew, who now looked like he wanted to vanish into the floor. "You let them dismantle your father," she said. "No, Mom, it's not—" "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't lie. Not today." Vanessa stepped in, her voice smooth. It was just a staging choice. The photographer liked the light. Ruth's gaze didn't leave her son. And you liked the silence. He opened his mouth, closed it, then rubbed his temple. We'll put it back, he murmured. The altar, after the wedding. You think that matters? Silence. Ruth stepped back, her breath shallow. The room felt tighter now, airless. You've turned this into a showroom, she said, voice trembling with something more than anger. A place for guests, not ghosts. I understand, but you should have asked. Matthew looked down. Vanessa said nothing, and Ruth knew in that moment she had not just been forgotten, she had been replaced. The silence thickened around them, like dust that had been disturbed but hadn't yet settled. Ruth remained still, her eyes sweeping slowly from the engagement photo to Matthew's downcast expression. Vanessa, standing poised by the doorway, folded her arms gently, her nails perfectly manicured against the soft silk of her blouse. I didn't come to cause trouble, Ruth said at last, her voice even. I came because you planned a wedding at my house and forgot to mention it. Matthew shifted his weight but said nothing. Ruth reached into her tote bag, pulled out the worn folder, and laid it flat on the sleek console table beneath the curated family photos. I brought this, she said, tapping the folder once. It's the deed. Vanessa's expression didn't flicker. Cedar Hollow, as you've decided to call it, is still under my name, sole ownership, no leases, no permission signed. Matthew opened his mouth. Mom, come on. She raised one hand calmly. Let me finish. He closed it. I haven't seen you in almost a year, Matthew. Not since you borrowed the keys and said you needed a place to relax. You said you'd take care of it. I have, he said softly. No, Ruth interrupted, sharper now. You remodeled it. You erased it. Vanessa stepped forward. Her voice was smooth as glass. The renovations were necessary. The place was falling apart. It was lived in, Ruth said, her voice quiet. Not broken. Matthew stepped between them. We didn't mean to overstep. You didn't mean anything, Ruth said. That's the problem. You didn't think about what this house meant to anyone but your guest list. Vanessa's lips parted in a smile, polished, practiced, empty. Well, she said, her tone sliding like ice across a surface. We were going to bring this up after the wedding, but perhaps now's as good a time as any. She turned slightly, her eyes steady on Ruth. We're planning to purchase the property after the ceremony, once all the guests are gone and the paperwork's in order. Ruth blinked. Matthew looked away. Vanessa's voice remained unnervingly pleasant. It's the most logical step. The house is in need of modern upkeep, and frankly, it's already been significantly improved under our direction. Our direction? Ruth echoed. You weren't using it, Vanessa continued smoothly. It sat idle for years. Matthew and I brought it back to life. You mean you redecorated it to look like a luxury rental? Ruth said. Vanessa shrugged slightly, unbothered. Tomato, tomato. Ruth's hand rested on the folder. You were going to ask me to sell. Yes, Vanessa said, smiling again. After the wedding, once emotions weren't so in the way. Ruth studied her. Vanessa didn't blink. You know it's mine, Ruth said finally, legally, sentimentally, spiritually. Yes, Vanessa said, which is why it would be much smoother if you simply allowed this weekend to proceed without conflict. Enjoy the ceremony, let the guests be happy. Then we can discuss numbers. The air between them sharpened. You expect me to sit in a house that used to be mine? Ruth said slowly. Watch you take photos in front of what used to be my husband's altar and pretend that it doesn't feel like a burial? Vanessa's smile didn't move. You're invited to sit wherever you like. Ruth didn't answer. I understand this is difficult, Vanessa said, as if reading a line from a manual. But it's just property, Ruth, and memories fade. What we're offering is fair. Matthew still hadn't spoken. His silence was the loudest sound in the room. Ruth looked at him now, really looked. Do you agree with her? He shifted under her gaze. It's complicated. No, she said, it's not. He sighed. We thought maybe it was time for something new, a fresh start. For whom? She asked. For all of us. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ruth exhaled slowly. She opened the folder, pulled out a copy of the deed, and laid it next to the engagement photo. "I'm not selling," she said. Vanessa's smile finally wavered. "This house is my husband's legacy, my son's childhood, my sanctuary. I won't let you turn it into a Pinterest backdrop." "Ruth," Matthew began. "No," she said. "Don't try to soften this. Not now." Vanessa leaned in slightly, her voice low. "If you're looking for gratitude, you'll be disappointed." "I'm not looking for gratitude," Ruth replied. "I'm looking for recognition." Vanessa's smile returned, cooler this time. "Well, you've been recognized." Ruth closed the folder with a snap. Matthew cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe we can talk later." She turned to him. "You had a decade to talk. You used it to disappear." He winced. "I'm not here to beg," Ruth said. "I'm here to witness." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Witness what exactly?" Ruth's eyes met hers, steady, calm, unmoving. "The cost of being forgotten." The guest room smelled different now. The lavender sachet Ruth had once kept in the drawer was gone, replaced by something crisp and artificial. She sat on the edge of the bed, her suitcase unopened at her feet, the envelope with the deed still clutched in one hand. Around her, everything had been updated. New sheets, new curtains, a minimalist lamp that turned on with a touch she couldn't find. She felt like a visitor in her own home. No, worse than that. She felt like a ghost. Downstairs, the voices had died down. Vanessa had retreated to the master bedroom. Harold's old room, now scrubbed clean of him. Matthew was likely on the phone, smoothing out some last-minute seating chart disaster or checking in with the caterer. Everyone had a role. Everyone belonged, except her. Ruth took off her shoes slowly, placing them neatly beside the bed. Her body ached, not just from the long drive or the confrontation, but from the dull, familiar weight of being sidelined. She lay down without changing, arms crossed over her chest like she was preparing for burial. The ceiling above was the same. They hadn't repainted that, at least. She stared at it, letting her mind drift to a time when this house was filled with noise, when Matthew used to run through these halls, his socks sliding on the wood floors, Harold calling after him in mock frustration. There had been laughter. There had been life. She remembered one winter when she'd caught the flu. High fever, racking cough, too dizzy to get out of bed. She told Matthew, a freshman in college then, not to worry, to stay on campus and study. He showed up 3 hours later, suitcase in one hand, soup in the other. "I couldn't focus knowing you were sick," he'd said, wrapping her in an extra blanket. He sat with her all night, refreshing her water, checking her temperature, reading aloud from her favorite mystery novel even when she drifted in and out of sleep. She had never felt more loved. Now, she was a line item on a renovation invoice, a name to be omitted for aesthetic reasons. She turned on her side, unable to sleep, the past pushing up through the floorboards like weeds. The ticking of the modern wall clock was too precise, too sterile. She sat up, frustrated, and reached for her bag, needing something to ground her. The folder with the deed was still there. She opened it again, not because she didn't believe what it said, but because it was the only proof she had that her presence mattered. As she thumbed through the old documents, a thin sheet slipped out, one she didn't remember placing there. It looked newer, crisp. Curious, she brought it closer to the light. It was a copy of a legal renovation request filed with the local zoning office. Property, 42 Willow Bend Lane. Owner, Ruth Eleanor Bennett. Her eyes narrowed. Signature, Ruth E. Bennett. Only, it wasn't her handwriting. She froze. The loops were wrong, the slant too sharp. The R curled backwards, something she'd never done in her life. Her breath caught in her throat. Vanessa. Ruth flipped the page, her hands now trembling. There were annotations, structural changes, permits for external work, a clause granting temporary property access during remodeling. But the real betrayal was in the signature. Neat, elegant, fraudulent. She'd never seen this form before. Never signed anything, never agreed to renovations, much less permitted the destruction of her husband's altar. Her chest tightened, cold blooming in her lungs. They hadn't just excluded her, they'd impersonated her. She stood abruptly, the document clutched in one hand. Her heart pounded in her ears. Betrayal was one thing, but forgery? That was criminal, and yet She paused. Would confronting them change anything? Vanessa would smile her way through it. Matthew would apologize with his eyes, not his words, and somehow Ruth would still be the difficult one. The obstacle. But this was her name, her signature, her home. She sat back down slowly, the document spread across her knees, and reached for her reading glasses. She needed to be sure. She compared the signature to a tax form she kept in the same folder. The difference was stark. Her R sloped differently. The spacing was uneven. She dotted her I's too low, always had. The forgery was convincing to a stranger. But not to Ruth, not to the woman who had signed her name thousands of times to checks, school permission slips, condolence letters, and mortgage renewals. She knew her own hand, and someone else had pretended to own it. She sat in the stillness for a long time, watching the shadows shift across the guest room wall. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees like distant applause, or warning. Tomorrow would be filled with white chairs, toasts, curated memories. But tonight, Ruth had found something real, and it changed everything. Morning light crept into the guest room like an uninvited guest, brushing across Ruth's face. She hadn't slept. The forged signature still sat where she'd left it. Flattened, undeniable, damning. She stared at the ceiling, not out of despair now, but calculation. By the time the clock struck 7, she had made her decision. Coffee first, then a phone call. The kitchen was already bustling. A florist had arrived early, arms full of white peonies. Vanessa, barefoot and already fully dressed, stood near the island, directing arrangements like a general on a battlefield. Her voice, calm but clipped, moved through the air with authority. Ruth didn't say a word. She poured herself a cup of coffee, then retreated to the sunroom, the one room they hadn't redesigned completely. The light still filtered through the original glass panes. The cat, someone's or maybe a stray, jumped into her lap as if it knew where comfort could still be found. She dialed the number she had stored in her phone for years, though she hadn't used it since Harold passed. Reynolds & Company, a familiar voice answered. This is April. Good morning, Ruth said calmly. May I speak with Thomas Coe? There was a pause. One moment, please. When Thomas came on, his tone shifted immediately. Mrs. Bennett, what a surprise. I hope everything is... I need a verification, she said, and quickly. She explained the situation, the property, the event, the unauthorized renovations, and most importantly, the forged signature. Thomas grew quiet. Then, do you still have a physical copy of the deed? I do, she said, with the original notary stamp. It was never transferred. No lease, no addendum, no sale. Then legally, you're still the sole owner, he confirmed. Good, Ruth said. I don't want to take it back. He hesitated. I don't follow. I'm not trying to stop the wedding, but I want something in writing. Go on. I want a formal acknowledgment of my rights as the property owner, Ruth said, and 2 conditions. Thomas listened. 1, I sit at the head table, not tucked away with the elderly guests, not next to the coat rack. My name belongs beside the groom's. Understood. And 2, a corrected invitation must be issued to all attending, digital or printed. It must include my full name, as the mother of the groom. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, that's not unreasonable. Shall I draft the document and send it to their counsel? No, Ruth said. Send it to me. I'll present it myself. He didn't argue. You've always been precise. I've had to be, she said. She hung up and sipped her coffee slowly, the cat purring in her lap. The sky beyond the window was clear, almost too perfect. A backdrop like everything else. She would not be a prop. By mid-morning, the household was in full chaos. Vendors, decorators, relatives arriving early. Matthew hadn't looked her in the eye once. Vanessa moved with grace through the crowd, checking details, greeting guests, smoothing chaos with designer smiles. Ruth watched her from the hallway as she handed a tablet to a young woman with a headset. Final guest confirmations, Vanessa said. Make sure everyone on this list is double-checked. The woman nodded and walked off. Ruth's curiosity tugged at her. She waited for a moment, then approached the tablet Vanessa had left behind on the console. It was still open. The screen glowed with an interactive guest list. She scrolled, page after page of names, RSVPs, table assignments. She reached the J's. Her heart skipped. There it was, Ruth Eleanor Bennett, status duplicate, flagged for review. Her fingers tightened on the tablet. Flagged. Duplicate. The oldest trick in the book. Claim a guest's data entry appeared twice, then quietly remove one. Accidental, of course. Easy to fix, just a technicality. Vanessa hadn't just forged her signature. She had planned to erase her entirely. Ruth closed the tablet quietly. Her expression didn't change, not yet. She walked outside where Vanessa was now arranging centerpieces on the back patio. "Vanessa," Ruth called, her voice light. Vanessa turned, smile tight. "Yes?" "I've spoken to my lawyer," Ruth said, handing her a neatly folded document. "This is a use agreement." Vanessa opened it, her eyes scanning quickly. "This isn't necessary." "It is," Ruth replied. "You'll find it outlines your ability to host the event, under condition." Vanessa's smile faltered. "I sit at the main table," Ruth continued, "and my name appears where it belongs, on every invitation, officially, as the mother of the groom." Vanessa looked up slowly. "And if we don't comply?" "Then I file a report about the forgery," Ruth said, her voice low, "and I rescind access to the property. You can explain to your guests why the wedding is canceled mid-setup." Vanessa's face hardened. "That's a bold move." "No," Ruth said. "It's a mother remembering her name." The rehearsal dinner glowed with curated perfection. Tables dressed in ivory linen, menus printed in gold foil, soft music weaving through the air like perfume. Everyone moved with practiced elegance, glasses clinking, laughter rising like it had been choreographed. Ruth stood in the foyer for a full minute before anyone noticed her. She was dressed simply, a navy blue dress she'd had for years, the one she wore to Harold's memorial. Her hair pinned back with the same silver clip her son had bought her when he was 12. There was nothing flashy about her presence, except that she was there, present, unshakable. When she stepped into the main dining room, a hush rippled through the space. The kind of quiet not caused by anger or reverence, but surprise. People who hadn't seen her in years blinked twice. Some smiled faintly, unsure. Others turned away, eyes darting toward Vanessa or Matthew, looking for cues. Ruth kept walking. Her heels echoed softly on the hardwood. She passed guests who had been laughing seconds before, now frozen with half-filled flutes raised mid-toast. At the head table, Matthew stood slowly, his face unreadable. Vanessa's expression flickered, just once, then reset into a neutral mask. Ruth took her seat at the main table without waiting for permission. The seat beside her was empty. She folded her hands in her lap. Vanessa leaned toward Matthew and whispered something tight. He nodded slowly, eyes still on his mother. The dinner resumed, barely. Conversation stuttered back into life like a scratched record that couldn't find the rhythm again. Ruth remained quiet. She ate when served, sipped water when glasses were filled. She did not force a smile. She did not explain herself. She was the story no one had planned for. Near dessert, the DJ stepped to the microphone. A young man in a fitted black suit, clearly more used to beach parties and rooftop receptions than emotional landmines. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with a rehearsed smile, "before we wrap up this beautiful evening, the couple has invited a few words from family." Vanessa stiffened slightly. Matthew looked down at his plate. The DJ continued, "We've heard from the maid of honor, the best man, say, and now," he glanced at the card in his hand, "we'd like to welcome someone very special, the grandmother of the groom." There was a pause, a confused murmur. Matthew's brow furrowed. Vanessa's face went pale. Ruth blinked. "Mrs. Ruth Bennett," the DJ said clearly, "would you honor us with a few words?" A beat of silence, then applause, scattered at first, polite, then stronger. People looked around, unsure, but followed suit. Chairs creaked, someone whistled softly. Ruth stood slowly. Her knees ached, but her spine stayed straight. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't planned for it. She walked to the microphone with careful steps. The room watched. When she arrived, she didn't touch the mic. She didn't need amplification. Her voice came steady, quiet, but filled with something raw and earned. "I wasn't sure I would speak tonight," she began, "and until a few seconds ago I didn't know I'd be invited to." A ripple of awkward laughter. "But I'm here," she said, eyes sweeping the crowd. And for the first time in a very long time, someone called me by name. Matthew looked up. "My name is Ruth," she said. "I'm Matthew's mother. I raised him in a house with a leaky roof, a stubborn stove, and more love than money. I gave him his first fishing rod. I held his hand when his father passed. I taught him how to make pancakes, burnt the first 10, and ate every one." Soft laughter now, warmer. "I wasn't on the first invitation list," she said, "but I'm still here. Not because I demanded it, but because I remembered who I was." She looked directly at Matthew. "You may forget your mother when you fall in love, but she never forgets you." Vanessa looked away. Ruth smiled faintly. "I won't keep you long. I just wanted to say thank you to the young man who once promised to buy me a castle, who now stands beside the woman he loves. I hope you build something together. Stronger than stone, braver than silence." She paused. "And if you ever wonder where your foundation lies, look homeward." She stepped back. No one clapped at first, then one hand, then another, then the whole room. Not thunderous, but real. Ruth returned to her seat. Her heart pounded, not from nerves, but release. For 20 years she had vanished behind politeness. Tonight she drew the line, and they had finally seen her. They cleared the plates without announcing dessert, but Ruth noticed none of that mattered anymore. In the soft afterglow of her speech, the room buzzed with something else. Aftershock, air pockets of tension. People shifted in seats, exchanged glances, whispered behind polite smiles. Ruth remained calm, sipping her water slowly. This wasn't her moment. It was hers. The microphone sat silent now, waiting for grace notes or laughter. Instead, it held echoes. She watched Vanessa across the table. The applause had barely carried when Vanessa's expression tensed. A muscle flickered in her jaw. Ruth saw it, even more vivid in the subdued light. It was the moment a mask began to crack. A guest at a nearby table tapped their phone. Soon, glimmers of screens illuminated faces. A video, Ruth's speech, was going viral, comments already crafting responses. "Mother of the Year, so graceful. True class." Ruth held her composure. That was enough. Vanessa caught sight of one screen mid-scroll. Her lips thinned even further. She reached under the table, gripping the card of another guest. She reread it. Her brow tightened. She discreetly called someone in a corner. She sounded urgent. Ruth didn't need to hear words. The body language was enough. Matthew leaned toward his wife, softly, apologetically, placating. But Vanessa's head stayed lowered, thumb scrolling. Her message was clear, control slipping. After dinner, drinks moved outside by the fire pit. Guests poured out onto the lawn. The young DJ packed up, murmuring apologies at leaving before having a moment. Someone had the video playing on their phone by the fire, that constant loop of Ruth's calm, powerful words. Ruth moved quietly into the night air toward the dock. Memories tugged at her. Harold's old wooden carving boat sat by the water's edge, the only relic left in its original place. Pine needles drifted across the planks. The gods of the lake had preserved this one truth. The phone buzzed in her purse. She checked it discreetly. Notifications of shares, comments referencing the mother clicked on the mic instead of stepping away. A few tagged Vanessa's name, her family's name. Critique followed. She had insurance against forgiveness. So much entitlement. Vanessa's power play backfires. All of it, Ruth thought, about her? No, about the truth. A woman who stands calmly and names herself, it shakes a lot of people. Behind her, not far, Matthew joined her. He didn't smile. He didn't speak at first. He watched the lanterns glimmer on the water. "I saw your speech," he said quietly, "on someone's phone." "You didn't watch it in the dining room?" she asked. He paused. I couldn't." "Understandable." He sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, doesn't seem to fit." "You didn't need to apologize in front of everyone." He nodded. "But maybe I did privately." They stood for a moment in silence, the lake steady beneath them. Just an echo of distant voices and nighttime insects, an orchestra of aftermath. Ruth looked at him. You love her. He met her gaze. Yes. How long were you complicit? He winced. Too long. Behind him, through a window, a group of guests stood, still watching the video. Among them, someone with a microphone recorded live commentary. Comments tumbled, Vanessa stepping back, uncomfortable. Her finger pressed to her lips. Ruth didn't avert her eyes. She had drawn the line. The net had snapped in midair. Matthew cleared his throat. What will you do tomorrow? She took a breath. I'll sit at the table. I'll answer their toasts. I'll allow it, on my terms. He nodded slowly. And Vanessa? She stared into the dark lake. She can imagine. Later that night, Ruth found the law folder on the desk in the guest room. A printed summary of her property rights, photocopied and stacked. A polite envelope lay beside it, addressed in typed type to Ms. Bennett. Inside, an unsigned agreement with a digital watermark from a legal drafting firm. She read it and saw where Vanessa had left her pride. Small concession, under duress. Ruth sighed, but she didn't feel anger. Anger ends you. Resolve rebuilds. The next morning, guests asked for photos near the altar, near the dock. Ruth watched the photographer's screen as her face flickered, her name finally spoken online. A hashtag began to form as someone posted, #Mother not ghost. Vanessa, through it all, gave no face. Her eyes flicked once to Ruth, then away. Ruth didn't look for apology. She looked for recognition. On the drive back later that week, Ruth heard the video notifications still rolling. Share after share, messages asking about her story. Where to buy that dress? Any news on Ruth? I feel seen. She sat beside her suitcase, the lakehouse receding, and though she'd left a physical place, she left behind a truth that would linger. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had needed to name herself, and in doing so, she changed the only story that ever mattered. The morning after the wedding dawned with an eerie stillness. The lake was glass now, its surface mirror smooth, reflecting a sky too pale for celebration. Inside, the house felt oddly oversized, echoes hollow where previously there'd been laughter and chatter. The staff had long since left. The decorations were packed away. Only Ruth remained, untouched, unseen, but undeniably present. No one came to bid her farewell. Not Vanessa, not Matthew, not a single guest. She sat in the clean, quiet kitchen, a cup of lukewarm tea resting in her hands. The baristas they'd hired had prepared decadent pastries and espresso drinks yesterday. Now the trays were empty, except for crumbs. The sun filtered through newly installed blinds, casting geometric shadows across the tablecloth. She traced invisible lines on the wood, remembering the mornings she'd practiced her fishing knot by this window. Remembering the nights she'd worried over overdue bills until the math made sense. Remembering every birthday she baked his cake, every storm she comforted his youth under. No thank you, no farewell hugs, just silence. A small surrender, a concession to exhaustion came over her. It was tempting to leave the whole scene behind, drive away and pretend the last few days were just a blur. But as she sat there, the realization surfaced. She had not come to finish a ceremony. She had come to reclaim a piece of herself, and she would not leave without claiming it. Behind her, the door to the study was cracked open. She rose silently and walked over. Inside, the cleaning crew had hastily shoved aside some boxes, revealing the desk. On it lay a manila envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges. It hadn't been there the night before. Ruth picked it up. Inside were documents, a draft real estate contract, typed and formatted, bearing the logo of a local realty firm. Handwritten notes by Vanessa's mother approving the final figures. It outlined a sale of 42 Willow Bend Lane, property of Ruth Eleanor Bennett, sold to a third party, a developer's name whispered in the margins. It was all prepared. The wedding was not just a takeover. It was a transaction in disguise. Her blood ran cold. She read through the pages carefully. The sale price exceeded fair market value, but the buyer was anonymous. A shell corporation set up to hide the true purchaser. Representatives lined up to sweep the paperwork out of sight once the event ceased public association. She remembered the legal notice they'd drafted the day before. You remember, I had agreed only to grant limited access as a use agreement. That paper still sat on the desk, initialed but not signed. She hadn't signed it. This was something more. She folded the papers and slipped them into her tote, along with the deed and guest list evidence. Her eyes softened, for Harold, for the years of silent breakfasts, for every moment spent believing in family. In that moment, she allowed herself a long, steady breath. She didn't feel righteous. She felt righteous power. Ruth moved through the empty house one last time, into the living room where the altar photo remained, untouched, into the guest room, her night's sanctuary, into the hallway where Harold's photo was framed again, now accompanied by a newly engraved plaque reading Legacy. She loaded the documents onto the table and dialed Thomas Coe, her lawyer. His voice sounded expectant, hopeful. "Thomas," she said, "I've found more." She explained with precision. Forgery, deceptive contract, third-party sale, each detail weighed but delivered calmly. He responded with professional urgency. "I'll get a cease and desist ready, and we'll notify the developer. You do not need to sell unless you choose to." She replied, "I won't." He paused. "So, where to from here?" She closed her eyes briefly, thinking. "I want to start fresh," she said, "with purpose, with ownership." He agreed to send drafts later that day. Ruth hung up and gazed outside. The lawn was littered with petals from the ceremony. A few chairs remained stacked. A table leaned against the porch, the remnants of what had been meant to erase her. Instead, they remained as evidence. Later, as the afternoon sun warmed the walls, Matthew came downstairs. No suit, no tie, just a memory of a boy he once was, standing at the threshold of a future he had helped build and almost destroyed. He did not approach. Ruth watched him from the kitchen table, distance in his posture and in his gaze. He cleared his throat, then whispered, "Mom." She nodded once, barely. I want to talk, privately, later." She nodded again. He left. Ruth stayed. Evening arrived, bringing with it gentle gusts carrying scent of pine and damp earth. She found herself walking toward the dock, again. She ran her fingers along the wooden railing, tracing shapes memory made. The wind chimes were back. She had ordered replacements overnight, exact replicas of the old ones. A quiet statement. She traced the outline of the carved boat Harold built and left it there. Its paint faded, wood soft. She remembered teaching Matthew to steady his breath before pushing off from the dock. She remembered the first time he tamed the oars himself. By the time darkness settled, the lanterns they'd strung flickered gently. Without guests, the scene was raw, real, her. She lit one candle at the altar space, not on ceremony but as a pause of remembrance. She wasn't seeking forgiveness. She was offering closure. At breakfast the next morning, Maria, the caterer, brought coffee and fresh muffins. She saw Ruth, sad but quiet, strong. "Are you okay, ma'am?" she asked softly. Ruth nodded. "More than okay. I'm finally myself." Maria blinked, unsure how to respond. "She changed, huh?" she murmured, nodding toward the window where Vanessa was still inside, phone in hand. Ruth just smiled. No bitterness, just peace. By noon, the real estate notice had pulled. The contract shelved indefinitely. Vanessa's mother called, voice polite and clipped, offering vague apologies. Ruth listened, acknowledging. A courtesy, not a capitulation. In that afternoon light, she packed her tote bag once more. Inside lay the deed, the purchase contract, the guest list with asterisks beside her name, but she'd already moved on. She placed the tote on the front seat of her car, walked past the house she owned, leaned into the open window and whispered, "Thank you." Then she drove away. Ruth didn't wait long to act. Within hours of discovering the forged real estate contract, she'd had the documents reviewed by her attorney, Thomas. By midday, the paperwork was moving through legal channels. She instructed him to file a motion with the county clerk to place an administrative freeze on any and all transactions involving 42 Willow Bend Lane. No sales, no leases, no transfers, no handshakes hidden behind ceremony, nothing. It was a quiet kind of thunder, the type that rumbles beneath feet, not across the sky. She didn't make a scene, didn't storm through the house or throw out accusations. Instead, she left one paper neatly placed on the kitchen island. a certified copy of the cease and desist order. Vanessa found it the next morning. Ruth was already gone, back to her modest cottage 2 towns away, but the house still echoed with her presence. Vanessa stood in the middle of the newly polished kitchen, staring at the notice. Her lips tightened. She read it twice, then again, frozen, not sold, not hers. Legally, the message was clear, but what stung wasn't the ink on the page. It was the fact that Ruth hadn't said a word to her. No confrontation, no drama, just a line drawn, crisp, undeniable. And in that silence, Vanessa understood. This woman doesn't need to yell. She owns the land I'm standing on. Ruth didn't gloat. She didn't call friends or write Facebook posts. She didn't need to. She watered her hydrangeas, paid the electric bill, reorganized her sewing drawer. Life resumed in quiet rhythms, but there was a shift. The phone rang less often now, yet each silence felt more like clarity than neglect. A week passed. Then, on a warm Tuesday afternoon, Matthew's car pulled into her driveway. She saw him from the window. No flowers, no apology in his hands, just a man with something to say and the hope that charm might outweigh memory. She opened the door before he could knock. "Hi, Mom," he said, offering a tight smile. "Matthew, can I come in?" She stepped aside, motioned toward the kitchen. He sat at the same table where she'd once fed him soup with a thermometer resting in her apron pocket. He cleared his throat. "I saw the notice about the property." She said nothing. "I wanted to talk to you, not about what happened at the wedding. That's done." She raised an eyebrow. "Done? I mean, not what I came to rehash." He exhaled sharply, adjusting in his seat. "Look, Mom, Vanessa and we're in a place right now where that house is a lot to maintain. And it means something to you, I know that. But it's also prime real estate. You saw the offer, right? It's generous." She still didn't speak, not yet. He leaned forward. "It could change our lives, set us up for the next decade." "You mean her life," Ruth said finally, voice even. "Because my life isn't in that equation." Matthew flinched. "That's not fair." "No? Then tell me something fair, Matthew. What's fair about forging my name on a contract? What's fair about turning my home into a wedding backdrop and pretending I was never there?" His voice tightened. "I didn't forge anything." She nodded. "You let it happen." He looked away. Ruth folded her hands. "I didn't freeze the property to punish you. I did it because I finally remembered who I am." He looked back, eyes searching. "Then remember you're also my mother, and I'm asking for your help." She studied him, her son, her boy who once cried over a scraped knee and promised to never move too far away. Now a man asking her to erase herself again. "You're not asking for help," she said gently. "You're asking for erasure, neatly, formally. You want my name gone so your future is easier." He opened his mouth, then shut it. "I'm not your housekeeper, Matthew, and I'm not a forgotten address on a guest list. I am the owner of that land, the soul of that home, and the woman who raised you through every storm you can't even remember." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm not selling," she said softly. "Not now, not to you, not to anyone." He stood abruptly. "So that's it? You're going to let this eat everything up?" "Mom, Vanessa's furious. This affects our finances, our future." She raised a hand. "Then build a different future, one that doesn't begin by stealing." He stared at her. A moment passed, too long, too quiet. Then he grabbed his keys and turned for the door. "Don't expect me to come begging again," he muttered. Ruth stood as he left. She watched him through the screen, his back stiff with offense. When the car pulled out of her drive, she sat back down and poured herself a fresh cup of tea. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She felt a strange calm, like planting roots deeper after a storm, like reclaiming ground she forgot she'd ever given up. And in that stillness, she whispered aloud, "I am not for sale." Margaret sat at the small oak writing desk beside the fireplace, the embers glowing faintly beneath her sandals. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the hall clock. She opened a fresh sheet of stationery, cream-colored, thick, familiar. She hadn't written a letter in years, not the kind with pen and ink that kept memories alive, but tonight felt important. She needed to remind herself who she was and what no one could take away. She wrote, "Dear Margaret, you exist, not because you are useful, not because you bring value in measurable terms. You exist because you once gave life, because you built something from nothing, because love of all kinds is real, even when it's invisible. You deserve dignity, not from your son, not from that woman, but from yourself. You have money, you have freedom, you have independence, you are not broken, you are revealed." With unfettered pride, Margaret Elliott, she folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope, then placed it alongside family photos, old greeting cards, and the napkin James used as a pilot's note when he flew cross-country in college. She would keep it for herself, for later, because some truths are meant to endure best in silence. The next morning, she opened her laptop and checked her Proton Mail inbox. There was a new message. Subject, "Thank you for everything." She clicked. A name she recognized appeared. Evelyn Parker, a distant acquaintance, sister of a friend. Evelyn had attended James and Samantha's wedding, sat at a table Margaret helped decorate, though Margaret wasn't formally invited. Email. "Dear Mrs. Elliott, I hope this email finds you well. I meant to speak with you at the wedding, but by the time I found you, you had left. I've regretted that all evening. Thank you for your kindness that day. It meant a great deal, especially this. My life has leaned on traditions. Family is ceremony, but tradition is only as strong as the love behind it. I realize now how much my family missed in excluding you. In the photos, I saw how poised you looked, head held high despite it all. I understood then, you are more than what they made you feel. You are love, grace, and quiet strength. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. And thank you for showing even from afar what real grace looks like. Warm regards, Evelyn Parker." Margaret blinked back surprise. She read the message twice. A warmth bloomed in her chest, a gentle current against memory's colder waves. She sipped her tea slowly and stared out the frost-patterned window. She thought about Henry. She thought about James as a boy climbing the tree in their backyard, scraped knee bleeding, clutching her hand tight. She thought about every decision she'd made, every sacrifice outweighed by a quieter wisdom. Her inbox refreshed, no follow-ups, no fear, just the silent testimony that truth carried distance and dignity. Later that afternoon, she walked into the garden. Some hydrangeas were shriveled from winter frost, but a few blossoms lingered, soft lavender heads stubbornly blooming even now. People often thought those were weeds, but Margaret saw them differently. She knelt beside one of the blooms and touched its petals lightly, cold and fragile yet alive. A thought settled. I outlived what they thought I was. She rose, brushing her knees, and opened her garden gate, just wide enough for her to step through. Her neighbors waved as she passed. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Elliott," Mrs. Henderson from next door called. "Your roses still look wonderful." Margaret returned the wave. They didn't know what had happened behind closed doors. They didn't know the legal freezes, the investigations, the financial filings. They only saw a woman doing what she always had, living. A woman who still existed on her own terms. Back inside, she placed the email printout beside the handwritten letter she'd written to herself. She looked at the two pieces of paper, one born of quiet resolve, the other of unexpected validation. She folded both into a single envelope and wrote on it, in blue ink, "Truths." She slid it into an unlabeled drawer. Some truths aren't for show, they're for the soul. In the evening, she lit a candle by Henry's photograph. The flame flickered softly, illuminating his smile, crinkled eyes, and the wind-blown jacket from their honeymoon. She closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Not more, not less. She had endured, and in that endurance she discovered something neither betrayal nor grief could touch. Truth lingered. After the email from Evelyn and her letter to herself, Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed in years. Quiet freedom, not from others, but from the fear that had traced her steps since James's wedding. She didn't expect congratulations or apologies. She expected nothing, and somehow that made all the difference. She didn't return Matthew's calls. She didn't respond to Vanessa's texts. She let the silence settle. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Instead, one crisp morning, she retrieved the pale cuttings of the lilac bush she had planted with Henry at their first house. The blue-purple blooms had faded years ago, but in their place, she found tender green shoots pushing through the soil. She redug the bed, aerated the earth, and planted fresh bulbs, supplemented with compost she had stored in buckets. She spoke to the plants as she worked. "You're still beautiful. You just needed time." Next, she placed small signs along her garden path. "Little free library," with a quaint wooden box made from scrap oak. She filled it with novels, biographies, poetry, a rotating selection neighbors could take or leave. She nailed "no fees, no judgment, just stories." The neighbors started to notice. Folks brought books back, took new ones, and sometimes left little notes. "Thank you, Mrs. Elliott," or "Your collection saved me during the storm." Without fanfare, she held a tiny reading circle, 4 chairs on her front porch. Each Saturday morning, she invited 2 neighbors and 1 passerby. Sometimes a jogger paused. She served tea from her floral teapot, shared short readings, asked open questions. "What character felt most lost in this one? Did this remind you of someone you know?" It was simple, it was real, and word spread. The mayor's assistant showed up once. An elderly widower all of his life explained he had never read fiction until this group. A high school student discovered poetry and read a stanza aloud. "I will exist when you are gone, because love cannot be undone." Margaret's eyes drifted to the window pane beyond the porch. Her reflection superimposed over the white birch outside, older, softer, resolved. She had ended every relationship that treated her as invisible, cut anything dead on her vine, tended only what bloomed, not bitterness, just boundaries. 6 months later, on a rainy October afternoon, the front door opened again. Not to bring brunch or force apologies, but to confront consequences. Matthew stood at her porch with clasped hands, head bowed, and weary eyes. "Mother." His voice had aged since the last time they spoke. He wasn't angry, he was apologetic. Margaret didn't stand. She offered him a seat and a steaming mug of chamomile. He accepted both. I got divorced," he said quietly. She blinked. "I'm sorry." "It's over. I tried repairing it. I thought things would change, but they didn't." Margaret listened. He spoke of restlessness, resentment, the silent pressure of living someone else's shape. He admitted finally that guilt had turned love hollow. He said he'd realized that home wasn't inheritance. It was choice. They sat across from each other for a long while. At last he stood. "Mom, can we try again? I mean me, rebuilding a life without taking from you." Margaret didn't rush. She stood, approached him, and placed a hand gently on his shoulder, the same way she would reassure 6-year-old James, who feared thunder. She didn't hug him, not yet, but the space between them felt quieter. "You can start again," she said softly, "just like I did." He nodded, a small, sad smile appearing as tears gathered. The rain outside tapped against the glass. He asked about the reading circle and the library box. Her smile was gentle. "I'll save you a good book." He left with no promises, no demand, just hope cradled in his step. Evening settled over the house. Margaret lit her lilac bulbs with another string of soft solar lights. She walked past the reading box and paused at the sidewalk. The word "stories" carved into the wood seemed to glow in the dusk. Inside, she brewed coffee and sat at her desk. She opened the drawer labeled Truths and extracted the folded envelope. She pulled out her letter and the email printout. Her fingers traced the ink. Love, grace, quiet strength, a second chance. She refolded them together and locked the drawer. She didn't need acknowledgement now. Her worth had been reclaimed. As the wind rustled the lilac leaves outside, Margaret felt the truth she carried, not loud, not boastful, still lingering. Not because it needed proving, but because it endured.